This is a video on the story of Abraham and Isaac. This story is very strange, and a lot of people read this and they don't really know what to think of it. One time I was listening to a Bible answer program on the radio, and somebody called in and said, Abraham was willing to kill his son. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't be willing to kill my son. And I guess the message that he was sending was that he was more righteous than Abraham because he loved his son more than Abraham loved his son. And a lot of people may have that mentality. They may be offended by this story. But obviously this story is not told to teach the virtues of child sacrifice, because God did not want Abraham to sacrifice his son. He stopped him from doing that. And we know from other scriptures, obviously, that that's not condoned. Only the heathen sacrificed their children in the fire in other parts of the Bible. So what is the point of this story? I mean, what are we supposed to make of it? There are many things in the Bible that are difficult for us to understand because we have a limited understanding. We don't know what God knows. And so sometimes it takes some thought to really understand. So this video is going to be a Bible study where we attempt to understand the meaning of the story. I'd like to start off by asking you a question. What is the most important thing that the Israelites did? What is the greatest thing that they achieved? Well, remember the woman at the well. Jesus told her that salvation is of the Jews. Well, what did he mean by that? You mean you have to go through the Jews to be saved? I mean, why is salvation of the Jews? Well, if you read the scriptures, what you find is that the only way to be saved is by the Word of God, because you learn about God from the Word of God. How do you differentiate your God from another God? Well, we have the scriptures that tell us who He is. That's the only way that you can know what you're worshiping. Well, the Jews gave us the Word of God. That's why we have a Bible. Some people might say, well, the greatest thing they gave us was Jesus. But how do we know who Jesus is? Well, we read the Bible. The scriptures are really the greatest thing that Abraham's descendants gave us. That was their greatest responsibility. Now, over time, I've learned that if you're going to choose a person to be a leader and accomplish some goal, you want to choose a person who cares more about what they're trying to accomplish than anybody else, because that person will make sure that the job is done correctly. You might have somebody who technically has a little more knowledge in that area. They might have more experience. They might even be a natural leader. But if that person doesn't really care about the job that is being done, whether it be designing clothing or creating a website or making an automobile or whatever, if that person doesn't really care about what's being done, then the job is not going to be done right. I remember watching an interview with Steve Jobs, and he was saying when Apple became big, they hired a management company to manage the people, because it was becoming difficult to manage so many people. But he said that what they found was that this was not really a good idea, because the managers didn't really know much about computers, and although they might have been good leaders, they didn't really know what to do when it came to the direction of the company. And the guy that became the CEO of the company, he didn't really know anything about computers, and later on he actually admitted this. He said, I was not a good choice for this job. And so the company almost went bankrupt, and Steve Jobs was actually fired. I'm sure many of you know that story. But then Steve Jobs came back, and the rest is history. I mean, Apple was one of the most powerful companies in the world because they eventually got the people back in who cared about what they were doing. So if you're going to choose somebody to do a particular job, you want a person who cares about the job more than anybody else. So now we go to Abraham. When God chose Abraham, he was looking for a person who was going to preserve the word of God. That is, again, the most important thing the Israelites did. So he had to choose a person that cared more about the word of God than anybody else. Now, how do you determine how much you really value something? God wanted somebody who believed that the word of God was the number one priority. And that really is the number one priority in life. Our only link to our Creator is the Word of God. So, how do you determine who is really qualified? Well, if you want to determine how much you value something, a good way to do that is to ask a person to choose. Let's say you have to choose between your car and your house. You could only have one, either your car or your house. Which one would you choose? Well, probably you would choose your house. Well, that tells you that your house is more valuable to you than your car. What if I told you that you had to choose between your house and your child? Which one would you choose? Well, most likely you would choose your child. The house can be replaced, but the child cannot be replaced. So that's a good way to determine the value of something, and I think that's what God did. You see, God took the most valuable thing that Abraham owned, which was his child, and he asked Abraham to choose. He told Abraham to sacrifice his child. And at that point, Abraham had to choose between the commandment of God, the word of God, and his child. God didn't waste time with Abraham's livestock or his any of his possessions. He just went right to the most valuable thing that he owned, his only son. And he said, choose. Are you going to choose my word, or are you going to choose your son? And it was not an easy choice for Abraham. He probably thought about this for hours and hours and hours. And if a voice from heaven told me to kill my son, I would just ignore it. I would just assume that that's somebody trying to trick me. But somehow Abraham knew that this was God. And so Abraham had to choose between those two. And it was not an easy choice. He had to weigh the positives and the negatives. If he chose his son, then he would know that his son is more important than the commandments of God. But there was something in the back of his mind that told him he can't make that choice. So he chose to follow the commandments of God. But as we all know, he prepared to kill his son, and God stopped him. And again, I think the purpose of this story is to teach the whole world and to teach Abraham that he was chosen because he valued the word of God above all else, even his only son. And, that man that called the radio program and said, well, I would not kill my son, he wouldn't kill his son, and that's why he would not be chosen by God. Most people in the world, they would choose their son over the word of God. It's not about the virtues of child sacrifice. It's about priorities. If you have to choose between the most valuable thing that you own and the word of God, which one are you going to choose? Well, most people would not choose the word of God. Church is just something that you do for 1 hour a week. But Abraham was chosen because he valued the word of God above all else. Most of us, we probably would have failed that test, and we would not have been chosen to carry down the Word of God and the knowledge of God throughout the centuries. So again, just to summarize here, I believe that that's why we have this story in the Bible. It shows the whole world why God chose Abraham. Oftentimes people joke and they say, well, the Jews, they think they're the chosen people. They're special. What makes them so special? Well, this story tells us why Abraham was chosen and the millions of other people that existed at that time on earth were not chosen.